Chapter 8, Part 2. Breadalby. In the morning, when Gerald awoke and heard Birkin move, he called out, "I still think I ought to give the Pussum £10. "Oh, God," said Birkin, "don't be so matter-of-fact. Close the account in your own soul, if you like. It is there you can't close it." "How do you know I can't?" "Knowing you." Gerald meditated for some moments. "It seems to me the right thing to do, you know, with the Pussums, is to pay them." "And the right thing for mistresses, keep them. And the right thing for wives, live under the same roof with them. Integer vitae scelerisque purus," said Birkin. "There's no need to be nasty about it," said Gerald. "It bores me. I'm not interested in your peccadilloes." "And I don't care whether you are or not. I am." The morning was again sunny. The maid had been in and brought the water, and had drawn the curtains. Birkin, sitting up in bed, looked lazily and pleasantly out on the park, that was so green and deserted, romantic, belonging to the past. He was thinking how lovely, how sure, how formed, how final all the things of the past were. The lovely, accomplished past. This house, so still and golden, the park slumbering its centuries of peace. And then what a snare and a delusion, this beauty of static things. What a horrible, dead prison Breadalby really was. What an intolerable confinement, the peace. Yet it was better than the sordid, scrambling conflict of the present. If only one might create the future after one's own heart. For a little pure truth, a little unflinching application of simple truth to life, the heart cried out ceaselessly. "I can't see what you will leave me at all to be interested in," came Gerald's voice from the lower room. "Neither the Pussums, nor the mines, nor anything else." "You be interested in what you can, Gerald, only I'm not interested myself," said Birkin. "What am I to do at all, then?" came Gerald's voice. "What you like. What am I to do myself?" In the silence Birkin could feel Gerald musing this fact. "I'm blessed if I know," came the good-humoured answer. "You see," said Birkin, "part of you wants the Pussum, and nothing but the Pussum. Part of you wants the mines, the business, and nothing but the business. And there you are, all in bits. And part of me wants something else," said Gerald, in a queer, quiet, real voice. "What?" said Birkin, rather surprised. "That's what I hoped you could tell me," said Gerald. There was a silence for some time. "I can't tell you. I can't find my own way, let alone yours." "You might marry," Birkin replied. "Who, the Pussum?" asked Gerald. "Perhaps," said Birkin, and he rose and went to the window. "That is your panacea," said Gerald, "but you haven't even tried it on yourself yet, and you are sick enough." "I am," said Birkin. "Still, I shall come right." "Through marriage?" "Yes," Birkin answered obstinately. "And no," added Gerald. "No, no, no, my boy." There was a silence between them, and a strange tension of hostility. They always kept a gap, a distance between them. They wanted always to be free, each of the other. Yet there was a curious heart-straining towards each other. "Salvator femininus," said Gerald satirically. "Why not?" said Birkin. "No reason at all," said Gerald. "If it really works.
But whom will you marry?"
"A woman," said Birkin.
"Good," said Gerald.
Birkin and Gerald were the last to come down to breakfast. Hermione liked everybody to be early. She suffered when she felt her day was diminished. She felt she had missed her life. She seemed to grip the hours by the throat, to force her life from them. She was rather pale and ghastly, as if left behind in the morning. Yet she had her power. Her will was strangely pervasive. With the entrance of the two young men, a sudden tension was felt. She lifted her face and said in her amused sing-song, "Good morning. Did you sleep well? I'm so glad." And she turned away, ignoring them. Birkin, who knew her well, saw that she intended to discount his existence. "Will you take what you want from the sideboard?" said Alexander, in a voice slightly suggesting disapprobation. "I hope the things aren't cold." "Oh, no." "Do you mind putting out the flame under the chafing dish, Rupert? Thank you." Even Alexander was rather authoritative where Hermione was cool. He took his tone from her inevitably. Birkin sat down and looked at the table. He was so used to this house, to this room, to this atmosphere, through years of intimacy. And now he felt in complete opposition to it all. It had nothing to do with him. How well he knew Hermione, as she sat there erect and silent and somewhat bemused, and yet so potent, so powerful. He knew her statically, so finely that it was almost like a madness. It was difficult to believe one was not mad, that one was not a figure in the Hall of Kings in some Egyptian tomb, where the dead all sat immemorial and tremendous. How utterly he knew Joshua Mattheson, who was talking in his harsh, yet rather mincing voice, endlessly, endlessly, always with a strong mentality working, always interesting, and yet always known. Everything he said known beforehand, however novel it was and clever. Alexander, the up-to-date host, so bloodlessly free and easy. Fräulein, so prettily chiming in just as she should. The little Italian countess taking notice of everybody, only playing her little game, objective and cold, like a weasel watching everything, and extracting her own amusement, never giving herself in the slightest. Then Miss Bradley, heavy and rather subservient, treated with cool, almost amused contempt by Hermione, and therefore slighted by everybody. How known it all was. Like a game with the figures set out, the same figures, the queen of chess, the knights, the pawns, the same now as they were hundreds of years ago. The same figures moving round in one of the innumerable permutations that make up the game. But the game is known. Its going on is like a madness. It is so exhausted. There was Gerald, an amused look on his face. The game pleased him. There was Gudrun, watching with steady, large, hostile eyes. The game fascinated her, and she loathed it. There was Ursula, with a slightly startled look on her face, as if she were hurt, and the pain were just outside her consciousness. Suddenly Birkin got up and went out. "That's enough," he said to himself involuntarily. Hermione knew his motion, though not in her consciousness. She lifted her heavy eyes and saw him lapse suddenly away on a sudden unknown tide, and the waves broke over her. Only her indomitable will remained static and mechanical. She sat at the table, making her musing, stray remarks. But the darkness had covered her. She was like a ship that has gone down. It was finished for her too. She was wrecked in the darkness. Yet the unfailing mechanism of her will worked on. She had that activity. "Shall we bathe this morning?" she said, suddenly looking at them all.
"Splendid," said Joshua. "It is a perfect morning."
"Oh, it is beautiful," said Fräulein.
"Yes, let us bathe," said the Italian woman.
"We have no bathing suits," said Gerald. "Have mine," said Alexander. "I must go to church and read the lessons. They expect me."
"Are you a Christian?" asked the Italian Countess, with sudden interest.
"No," said Alexander, "I'm not. But I believe in keeping up the old institutions."
"They are so beautiful," said Fräulein daintily. "Oh, they are!" cried Miss Bradley.
They all trailed out onto the lawn. It was a sunny, soft morning in early summer, when life ran in the world subtly, like a reminiscence. The church bells were ringing a little way off. Not a cloud was in the sky. The swans were like lilies on the water below. The peacocks walked with long, prancing steps across the shadow and into the sunshine of the grass. One wanted to swoon into the bygone perfection of it all. "Good-bye," called Alexander, waving his gloves cheerily, and he disappeared behind the bushes on his way to church.
"Now," said Hermione, "shall we all bathe?"
"I won't," said Ursula.
"You don't want to?" said Hermione, looking at her slowly.
"No, I don't want to," said Ursula.
"Nor I," said Gudrun.
"What about my suit?" asked Gerald.
"I don't know,"
laughed Hermione, with an odd, amused intonation.
"Will a handkerchief do? A large handkerchief?"
"That will do," said Gerald.
"Come along then," sang Hermione.
The first to run across the lawn was the little Italian, small and like a cat, her white legs twinkling as she went, ducking slightly her head that was tied in a gold silk kerchief. She tripped through the gate and down the grass, and stood like a tiny figure of ivory and bronze at the water's edge, having dropped off her towelling, watching the swans, which came up in surprise. Then out ran Miss Bradley, like a large soft plum in her dark blue suit. Then Gerald came, a scarlet silk kerchief round his loins, his towels over his arms. He seemed to flaunt himself a little in the sun, lingering and laughing, strolling easily, looking white but natural in his nakedness. Then came Sir Joshua in an overcoat, and lastly Hermione, striding with stiff grace from out of a great mantle of purple silk, her head tied up in purple and gold. Handsome was her stiff, long body, her straight stepping white legs. There was a static magnificence about her, as she let the cloak float loosely away from her striding. She crossed the lawn like some strange memory, and passed slowly and statelily towards the water. There were 3 ponds, in terraces descending the valley, large and smooth and beautiful, lying in the sun. The water ran over a little stone wall, over small rocks, splashing down from one pond to the level below. The swans had gone out onto the opposite bank. The reeds smelled sweet. A faint breeze touched the skin. Gerald had dived in after Sir Joshua, and had swum to the end of the pond. There he climbed out and sat on the wall. There was a dive, and the little Countess was swimming like a rat to join him. They both sat in the sun, laughing and crossing their arms on their breasts. Sir Joshua swam up to them and stood near them, up to his armpits in the water. Then Hermione and Miss Bradley swam over, and they sat in a row on the embankment.
"Aren't they terrifying? Aren't they really terrifying?" said Gudrun. "Don't they look saurian? They're just like great lizards. Did you ever see anything like Sir Joshua? But really, Ursula, he belongs to the primeval world, when great lizards crawled about." Gudrun looked in dismay on Sir Joshua, who stood up to the breast in the water, his long greyish hair washed down into his eyes, his neck set into thick, crude shoulders. He was talking to Miss Bradley, who, seated on the bank above, plump and big and wet, looked as if she might roll and slither in the water, almost like one of the slithering sea lions in the zoo. Ursula watched in silence. Gerald was laughing happily between Hermione and the Italian. He reminded her of Dionysus, because his hair was really yellow, his figure so full and laughing. Hermione, in her large, stiff, sinister grace, leaned near him, frightening, as if she were not responsible for what she might do. He knew a certain danger in her, a convulsive madness, but he only laughed the more, turning often to the little Countess, who was flashing up her face at him. They all dropped into the water, and were swimming together like a shoal of seals. Hermione was powerful and unconscious in the water, large and slow and powerful. Palestra was quick and silent as a water rat. Gerald wavered and flickered, a white, natural shadow. Then, one after the other, they waded out and went up to the house. But Gerald lingered a moment to speak to Gudrun. "You don't like the water?" he said. She looked at him with a long, slow, inscrutable look, as he stood before her negligently, the water standing in beads all over his skin. "I like it very much," she replied. He paused, expecting some sort of explanation. "And you swim?" "Yes, I swim." Still he would not ask her why she would not go in then. He could feel something ironic in her. He walked away, piqued for the first time. "Why wouldn't you bathe?" he asked her again, later, when he was once more the properly dressed young Englishman. She hesitated a moment before answering, opposing his persistence. "Because I didn't like the crowd," she replied. He laughed. Her phrase seemed to re-echo in his consciousness. The flavour of her slang was piquant to him. Whether he would or not, she signified the real world to him. He wanted to come up to her standards, fulfil her expectations. He knew that her criterion was the only one that mattered. The others were all outsiders, instinctively, whatever they might be socially. And Gerald could not help it. He was bound to strive to come up to her criterion, fulfil her idea of a man and a human being. After lunch, when all the others had withdrawn, Hermione and Gerald and Birkin lingered, finishing their talk. There had been some discussion, on the whole quite intellectual and artificial, about a new state, a new world of man. Supposing this old social state were broken and destroyed, then, out of the chaos, what then? The great social idea, said Sir Joshua, was the social equality of man. No, said Gerald, the idea was that every man was fit for his own little bit of a task. Let him do that and then please himself. The unifying principle was the work in hand. Only work, the business of production, held men together. It was mechanical, but then society was a mechanism. Apart from work, they were isolated, free to do as they liked.
"Oh," cried Gudrun, "then we shan't have names any more. We shall be like the Germans, nothing but Herr Obermeister and Herr Untermeister. I can imagine it. I am Mrs. Colliery Manager Cry. I am Mrs. Member of Parliament Roddice. I am Miss Art Teacher Brangwyn. Very pretty, that." "Things would work very much better, Miss Art Teacher Brangwyn," said Gerald. "What things, Mr. Colliery Manager Cry? The relation between you and me, par exemple?" "Yes, for example," cried the Italian. "That which is between men and women?" "That is non-social," said Birkin sarcastically. "Exactly," said Gerald. "Between me and a woman, the social question does not enter. It is my own affair." "A £10 note on it," said Birkin. "You don't admit that a woman is a social being?" asked Ursula of Gerald. "She is both," said Gerald. "She is a social being as far as society is concerned, but for her own private self she is a free agent. It is her own affair what she does." "But won't it be rather difficult to arrange the two halves?" asked Ursula. "Oh no," replied Gerald. "They arrange themselves, naturally. We see it now, everywhere." "Don't you laugh so pleasantly till you're out of the wood," said Birkin. Gerald knitted his brows in momentary irritation. "Was I laughing?" he said. "If," said Hermione at last, "we could only realise that in the spirit we are all one, all equal in the spirit, all brothers there, the rest wouldn't matter. There would be no more of this carping and envy and this struggle for power, which destroys, only destroys." This speech was received in silence, and almost immediately the party rose from the table. But when the others had gone, Birkin turned round in bitter declamation, saying, "It is just the opposite, just the contrary, Hermione. We are all different and unequal in spirit. It is only the social differences that are based on accidental material conditions. We are all abstractly or mathematically equal, if you like. Every man has hunger and thirst, 2 eyes, 1 nose, and 2 legs. We're all the same in point of number. But spiritually there is pure difference, and neither equality nor inequality counts. It is upon these 2 bits of knowledge that you must found a state. Your democracy is an absolute lie. Your brotherhood of man is a pure falsity, if you apply it further than the mathematical abstraction. We all drank milk first, we all eat bread and meat, we all want to ride in motor cars. Therein lies the beginning and the end of the brotherhood of man, but no equality. But I, myself, who am myself, what have I to do with equality with any other man or woman? In the spirit, I am as separate as one star is from another, as different in quality and quantity. Establish a state on that. One man isn't any better than another, not because they are equal, but because they are intrinsically other, that there is no term of comparison. The minute you begin to compare, one man is seen to be far better than another. All the inequality you can imagine is there by nature. I want every man to have his share in the world's goods, so that I am rid of his importunity, so that I can tell him, now you've got what you want, you've got your fair share of the world's gear. Now, you one-mouthed fool, mind yourself and don't obstruct me." Hermione was looking at him with leering eyes along her cheeks. He could feel violent waves of hatred and loathing of all he said coming out of her. It was dynamic
hatred and loathing coming strong and black out of the unconsciousness. She heard his words in her unconscious self. Consciously, she was as if deafened. She paid no heed to them. "It sounds like megalomania, Rupert," said Gerald genially. Hermione gave a queer grunting sound. Birkin stood back. "Yes, let it," he said suddenly, the whole tone gone out of his voice, that had been so insistent, bearing everybody down. And he went away. But he felt later a little compunction. He had been violent, cruel with poor Hermione. He wanted to recompense her, to make it up. He had hurt her. He had been vindictive. He wanted to be on good terms with her again. He went into her boudoir, a remote and very cushiony place. She was sitting at her table writing letters. She lifted her face abstractedly when he entered, watched him go to the sofa and sit down. Then she looked down at her paper again. He took up a large volume which he had been reading before, and became minutely attentive to his author. His back was towards Hermione. She could not go on with her writing. Her whole mind was a chaos, darkness breaking in upon it, and herself struggling to gain control with her will, as a swimmer struggles with the swirling water. But in spite of her efforts, she was borne down. Darkness seemed to break over her. She felt as if her heart was bursting. The terrible tension grew stronger and stronger. It was most fearful agony, like being walled up. And then she realised that his presence was the wall. His presence was destroying her. Unless she could break out, she must die most fearfully, walled up in horror. And he was the wall. She must break down the wall. She must break him down before her. The awful obstruction of him who obstructed her life to the last. It must be done, or she must perish most horribly. Terrible shocks ran over her body, like shocks of electricity, as if many volts of electricity suddenly struck her down. She was aware of him sitting silently there, an unthinkable, evil obstruction. Only this blotted out her mind, pressed out her very breathing. His silent, stooping back, the back of his head. A terrible, voluptuous thrill ran down her arms. She was going to know her voluptuous consummation. Her arms quivered and were strong, immeasurably and irresistibly strong. What delight in strength, what delirium of pleasure. She was going to have her consummation of voluptuous ecstasy at last. It was coming. In utmost terror and agony she knew it was upon her now, in extremity of bliss. Her hand closed on a blue, beautiful ball of lapis lazuli that stood on her desk for a paperweight. She rolled it round in her hand as she rose silently. Her heart was a pure flame in her breast. She was purely unconscious in ecstasy. She moved towards him and stood behind him for a moment in ecstasy. He, closed within the spell, remained motionless and unconscious. Then swiftly, in a flame that drenched down her body like fluid lightning, and gave her a perfect, unutterable consummation, unutterable satisfaction, she brought down the ball of jewel stone with all her force, crash on his head. But her fingers were in the way, and deadened the blow. Nevertheless, down went his head on the table on which his book lay. The stone slid aside and over his ear. It was one convulsion of pure bliss for her, lit up by the crushed pain of her fingers. But it was not somehow complete. She lifted her arm high to aim once more, straight down on the head that lay dazed on the table. She must smash it. It must be smashed before her ecstasy was consummated, fulfilled for ever. 1,000 lives, 1,000 deaths mattered nothing now. Only the fulfilment of this perfect ecstasy. She was not swift. She could only move slowly. A strong spirit in him woke him, and made him lift his face and twist to look at her. Her arm was raised, the hand clasping the ball of lapis lazuli. It was her left hand. He realised again with horror that she was left-handed. Hurriedly, with a burrowing motion, he covered his head under the thick volume of Thucydides, and the blow came down, almost breaking his neck and shattering his heart. He was shattered, but he was not afraid. Twisting round to face her, he pushed the table over and got away from her. He was like a flask that is smashed to atoms. He seemed to himself that he was all fragments, smashed to bits. Yet his movements were perfectly coherent and clear. His soul was entire and unsurprised. "No, you don't, Hermione," he said in a low voice. "I don't let you." He saw her standing tall and livid and attentive, the stone clenched tense in her hand. "Stand away and let me go," he said, drawing near to her. As if pressed back by some hand, she stood away, watching him all the time without changing, like a neutralised angel confronting him. "It is not good," he said, when he had gone past her. "It isn't I who will die. You hear?" He kept his face to her as he went out, lest she should strike again. While he was on his guard, she dare not move. And he was on his guard. She was powerless. So he had gone, and left her standing. She remained perfectly rigid, standing as she was for a long time. Then she staggered to the couch and lay down, and went heavily to sleep. When she awoke, she remembered what she had done, but it seemed to her she had only hit him as any woman might do, because he tortured her. She was perfectly right. She knew that spiritually she was right. In her own infallible purity she had done what must be done. She was right. She was pure. A drugged, almost sinister religious expression became permanent on her face. Birkin, barely conscious and yet perfectly direct in his motion, went out of the house and straight across the park, to the open country, to the hills. The brilliant day had become overcast, spots of rain were falling. He wandered onto a wild valley side, where there were thickets of hazel, many flowers, tufts of heather, and little clumps of young fir trees budding with soft paws. It was rather wet everywhere. There was a stream running down at the bottom of the valley, which was gloomy, or seemed gloomy. He was aware that he could not regain his consciousness, that he was moving in a sort of darkness. Yet he wanted something. He was happy in the wet hillside that was overgrown and obscure with bushes and flowers. He wanted to touch them all, to saturate himself with the touch of them all. He took off his clothes and sat down naked among the primroses, moving his feet softly among the primroses, his legs, his knees, his arms right up to the armpits, lying down and letting them touch his belly, his breasts. It was such a fine, cool, subtle touch all over him. He seemed to saturate himself with their contact. But they were too soft. He went through the long grass to a clump of young fir trees that were no higher than a man. The soft, sharp boughs beat upon him as he moved in keen pangs against them, threw little cold showers of drops on his belly, and beat his loins with their clusters of soft, sharp needles. There was a thistle which pricked him vividly, but not too much, because all his movements were too discriminate and soft. To lie down and roll in the sticky, cool young hyacinths, to lie on one's belly and cover one's back with handfuls of fine wet grass, soft as a breath, soft and more delicate and more beautiful than the touch of any woman. And then to sting one's thigh against the living dark bristles of the fir boughs, and then to feel the light whip of the hazel on one's shoulders, stinging, and then to clasp the silvery birch trunk against one's breast, its smoothness, its hardness, its vital knots and ridges. This was good. This was all very good, very satisfying. Nothing else would do, nothing else would satisfy, except this coolness and subtlety of vegetation travelling into one's blood. How fortunate he was that there was this lovely, subtle, responsive vegetation waiting for him as he waited for it. How fulfilled he was, how happy. As he dried himself a little with his handkerchief, he thought about Hermione and the blow. He could feel a pain on the side of his head, but after all, what did it matter? What did Hermione matter? What did people matter altogether? There was this perfect, cool loneliness, so lovely and fresh and unexplored. Really, what a mistake he had made, thinking he wanted people, thinking he wanted a woman. He did not want a woman, not in the least. The leaves and the primroses and the trees, they were really lovely and cool and desirable. They really came into the blood and were added on to him. He was enriched now immeasurably, and so glad. It was quite right of Hermione to want to kill him. What had he to do with her? Why should he pretend to have anything to do with human beings at all? Here was his world. He wanted nobody and nothing but the lovely, subtle, responsive vegetation, and himself, his own living self. It was necessary to go back into the world, that was true, but that did not matter, so one knew where one belonged. He knew now where he belonged. This was his place, his marriage place. The world was extraneous. He climbed out of the valley, wondering if he were mad. But if so, he preferred his own madness to the regular sanity. He rejoiced in his own madness. He was free. He did not want that old sanity of the world which was become so repulsive. He rejoiced in the new-found world of his madness. It was so fresh and delicate and so satisfying. As for the certain grief he felt at the same time in his soul, that was only the remains of an old ethic that bade a human being adhere to humanity. But he was weary of the old ethic, of the human being, and of humanity. He loved now the soft, delicate vegetation,
that was so cool and perfect. He would overlook the old grief. He would put away the old ethic. He would be free in his new state. He was aware of the pain in his head becoming more and more difficult every minute. He was walking now along the road to the nearest station. It was raining, and he had no hat. But then, plenty of cranks went out nowadays without hats in the rain. He wondered again how much of his heaviness of heart, a certain depression, was due to fear. Fear lest anybody should have seen him naked lying against the vegetation. What a dread he had of mankind, of other people. It amounted almost to horror, to a sort of dream terror, his horror of being observed by some other people. If he were on an island, like Alexander Selkirk, with only the creatures and the trees, he would be free and glad. There would be none of this heaviness, this misgiving. He could love the vegetation and be quite happy and unquestioned, by himself. He had better send a note to Hermione. She might trouble about him, and he did not want the onus of this. So at the station he wrote, saying: "I will go on to town. I don't want to come back to Breadalby for the present. But it is quite all right. I don't want you to mind having biffed me in the least. Tell the others it is just one of my moods. You were quite right to biff me, because I know you wanted to, so there's the end of it." In the train, however, he felt ill. Every motion was insufferable pain, and he was sick. He dragged himself from the station into a cab, feeling his way, step by step, like a blind man, and held up only by a dim will. For a week or two he was ill, but he did not let Hermione know, and she thought he was sulking. There was a complete estrangement between them. She became rapt, abstracted in her conviction of exclusive righteousness. She lived in and by her own self-esteem, conviction of her own rightness of spirit. End of chapter 8. Recording by Ruth